Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. Ukraine War News Update, first part off the 28th of March 2025. And we're going to go to the Ukrainian General Staff figures for the Russian losses for the day before. All the usual caveats apply for this, of course, as per normal. And we have some incredibly high numbers, some real upticks that I think are hugely significant. We're going to start with the personnel losses. 1,860 is a very high number there. We saw a huge uptick yesterday of 400 up to the 1,600 odd mark. And then today going up now into the high thousands. That is really significant. So 1,860 is the highest we've seen it for a long time. 17 tanks is almost double the daily average. And 61 troop-carrying AFVs is phenomenal. I think this signifies that the Russians are attacking, right? There is, I don't think, any doubt about that. Russians attacking, and we do hear news in, well, a couple of bits of news to go through that I was going to share with you later. No report saying, reporting what Ukrainian Armed Forces Major Valery Prozapas has said. Russia is preparing an offensive on Zaporizhia, Kherson, Mykolaiv and Odessa to link the occupied Crimean corridor to Transnistria. We often hear rumours or claims like this, and it always come to pass, but worth noting. And then we hear this. The Russians have intensified assaults in Zaporizhia, increasing pressure on Ukraine's southern positions. According to the military, the Russians want to get as much of a head start or advance as much as possible, according to spokesperson Vladislav Voloshin. So the possibly in a number of places on the front lines, the Russians are pushing, really going for it, and that's why you would see tanks and troop-carrying AFVs. You wouldn't see heavy losses of these vehicles if the Ukrainians were attacking, I don't think. That signifies Russian attacks. There is at least one video of the biggest Russian attack that we've seen for some time. I think there was something like 12 vehicles involved, but that was significant because we just haven't seen that for a long time. I mean, goodness me, remember back in the early days of the war, you might see attacks of like 30 to 60 vehicles, right? So through the course of the war, we have seen an evolution of how the Russians attack, and that's been driven at least somewhat by their access to materiel, which in this case, you know, is pretty desperate. When you look at the tanks, you're seeing a lot of tanks turned into APCs, the tracked guard and shed variety, and the same actually with some AFVs as well. They are being adapted. They're not being fixed up properly. I think they're running out of deep reserves. I think they're in desperate situations. But here we see that they are attacking with fairly large, but actually, comparatively speaking, over the course of the war, actually still relatively small, but fairly large for the recent month or 6 weeks. So that tells us, obviously, all of these stats tell us a story. Then we've got 122 artillery systems. So if we look at the daily stats, look at Dell's stats here, we look at, and I'll remove my face, but if you look at the stats for artillery, right, yes, that's a record. Obviously, it's a record. But our daily average is now, well, it's picked up a little bit, but it's at 22.4. So we're talking about almost 6 times the daily average. It's now reached an equal 30-day rolling average record, and vehicles and fuel tanks has reached an equal 7-day rolling average record. 210 loss. I mean, just phenomenal numbers here. Absolutely incredible. So 122 artillery systems. It is clear that the Ukrainians are doing something explicit with artillery. I mean, it just has to be. It can't just be an accident. Oh, we accidentally destroyed an absolute ton of artillery in the last month, right? This has to be something that they have been planning, and this has to be an explicit objective that they've put in for themselves. So if we look at the look at the tick up in the last recent weeks. In fact, you could say month, it went down. You look at the trend line now, that purple trend line has ripped right back up there. I mean, that is almost exponential, and we're just seeing phenomenal figures being posted by the Ukrainians. So there you go. One multiple launch rocket system, one anti-aircraft warfare system, that's obviously pretty good, and then 210 vehicles and fuel tanks. Again, the sort of category you'd expect to see if the Russians are mounting attacks, because they are attacking with ATVs, with golf buggies and motorbikes and all sorts. If we look at the graph here for the vehicles and fuel tanks, again, you've got a really steep gradient showing the trend is very much in Ukraine's favor at the moment. That blue line getting steeper as well. The total number of losses just going up. And you can see the thickness of the orange lines in the upper regions, over 100 here is now commonplace. It seems now it's a day of low losses if they get anything under 100 in terms of vehicles and fuel tanks. So incredible statistics, I think, here. Really high. Now, the question is, does this also translate to high Ukrainian losses? If the Russians are attacking in larger waves, are they therefore attriting the Ukrainians more? How much is this being reflected in the Ukrainian loss figures? We just don't know, of course. Right, drones have become the most lethal weapon in this war, says the Dead District. This is actually quoting from some Russian data, a Russian survey done. Out of 5,813 wounded surveyed in these Russian stats, firearms wounded took up 4% of the almost 6,000 people, 20.5% from artillery, and 75.5% were from drones. So drones are the big, one could assume, killer of the Russians, but certainly the big wounder of the Russian personnel. And then artillery, there was a time in the war when I was reporting that artillery was killing 80% of people, and snipers were the next biggest. Snipers were something like 8%, and drones weren't featuring. That was right at the beginning of the war. If you remember, there's a really big, interesting, fascinating it was by Yuri, what's his name? Is a sniper trainer, former theologian and sniper trainer, who was helping out the snipers get loads of kit and stuff. And he featured in a very large, very detailed Euromaidan press piece, was talking about how effective snipers are in killing enemy soldiers and whatnot. Drones didn't feature on those stats now. Wow, how times have changed. Now drones, 75.5% of Russian losses, or certainly wounded. Now, 20 Russian soldiers, including a platoon commander, have surrendered to the National Guard Brigade Azov in the Toretsk area. And this included, so it's a huge group noted there, included the platoon commander. This is, I think, really significant, and it illustrates that the Russians are under the cosh in certain places. When they lose troops, when there are POWs taken, when the Ukrainians are taking POWs, that means they are attacking. So that is a good sign that the Ukrainians are attacking. We also have Russian Major Marat Tibilov being killed in the Kursk region, apparently. I don't have any further confirmation of that, but we are thinking that General Lapin, who's really high up, was killed in a strike in Belgrade. I'm thinking it was a strike on a command post in Belgrade. That's one of the theories. He's kind of disappeared, and also that another major was killed in that strike, or another one in Belgrade as well. So there have been some fairly high-level people taken out recently. What else? Russians have launched an attack with 12 AFVs in Pokrovsk, on the Pokrovsk front today. So this is what I was talking about. An assault with 12 units of armor, something like that hasn't happened in a long time. It was quite hot in the Pokrovsk front in the Avdiivka area today. As I already wrote, Russians had accumulated a certain resource of armor and set off on an assault with 12 units of armored vehicles in a column under flags. Says this particular source. As a result, the entire column was completely destroyed. You can see some of the results of the work in the photos. These photos are the result of the work of the Birds of Magyar. So this entire column apparently was decimated before it reached its intended location by the Birds of Magyar. So drones, again, this is drones, who simply pecked at everything, and a 35th Brigade as well operating there. An unnecessary confirmation of the offensive weakness of the Russians, who, even having accumulated equipment, cannot do anything. And at the same time, an indicator that Ukrainian forces are able to continue to restrain the enemy's onslaught. And the guys showed this at the right moment. This will undoubtedly be because of the quality of the Birds of Magyar and generally the Ukrainian drone units and provision. I do wonder if the Ukrainians attacked in a similar manner, how much they would be attrited. What's the difference there between the success rate of the Ukrainian drone units and the Russian drone units? We are hearing on that front, there was a claim that the Ukrainians had a 6-1 drone advantage, and that was growing. So it was more now in Pokrovsk from a Russian, okay, pinch of salt. But, you know, it could be that this asymmetry allows Ukraine to better defend and potentially have a relatively more successful attacks than the Russians, given the assumption that the drones will be less effective on the Russian side, though they are still really effective. And it depends where you're on the front line as well. So things can change depending on what sector you're in. And in the last 24 hours, a Russian radar, a Zoopark radar, these are very expensive radar systems, was destroyed in the area of responsibility of Southern Defence Forces. So that's going to be around the Zaporizhia area, possibly. It could actually be down in Kherson region too. Oops, I didn't want to show that. Let's go back. Let's just pause that for a second. So that's a video that's actually coming from Zarina Zabritsky. I'm going to be interviewing her in a few hours later this afternoon, about 20 to 4 UK time. She's going to talk about, she reached out and said, look, can I come and speak to you about Kherson and what's going on there? It's horrific. Cars aflame, drones zooming through smoke, non-stop explosions, bodies, bloods, 37 artillery shells between 12:30 and 2:30, human safari, rescuers, civilians targeted, a train hit, 2 killed, 6 injured, power and water gone. Kherson is apocalyptic even by this city's standards. It's horrific there. Tim White says, update from Kherson now, where 2 people were killed in the mass shelling today and 5 more injured. Photos have been published following the barrage right in the center of the city. And yeah, terrible stuff going on in Kherson. I did ask her when I interviewed her last time, look, why are you living in Kherson? Why have you taken yourself to live there? Incredible. But sad. Partisans have torched a railway relay station in Voronezh, disrupting Russian fuel logistics. That's good news that they are still active. And a pretty big fire in Crimea. Now, don't know what could have caused it, but it, as Tim White says, could be interesting. Officially, some garages are burning in Feodosia, but roads were quickly closed off to deny access. And some locals say a building is on fire which may belong to Russia's military police. So there could be some sabotage or even a strike there, but more likely sabotage. Or, I don't know, careless smokers at garages. Yeah, bit of an explosion going on there. Okay, moving on to distance strikes then. So yet again, typically another huge wave of Shahid attacks into Ukraine. 163 drones. That's a huge number. 89 were taken out with conventional means. 51 suppressed by electronic warfare. That gives you, what is it, 140 out of 163. 23, therefore, not getting shot down or taken out. That is a really high number of drones to get through. The Ukrainians continuing to struggle to take down these drones to the degree that they previously were, and I think that's a huge issue. Now, I don't actually have any information really about what drone damage there was overnight. Just sort of general statements over the last day or so. I'm just checking the socials, see if there's any news that's come out. No. Yeah, not really seeing anything there. I'll check again in a wee while. But that 23 drones is a lot to get through. We, as I shared with you yesterday, we're hearing that a Patriot systems have shot down about 100 ballistic missiles in total, most of which are flying towards Kyiv. Imagine if 100 ballistic missiles had hit Kyiv. Imagine if you just had 100 ballistic missiles hitting the city now. 100, what damage would be done, and especially if they were hitting the targets they were intended to hit. Strategic targets, really important, administrative or military targets in Kyiv. Those ballistic missiles could have done an insane amount of damage. So that's the value of the Patriots. And as I keep speculating, it could be something that the Americans hold over the Ukrainians in terms of being able to acquire the ballistic missiles as targets and shoot them down using American intelligence could be a really key component of why the Ukrainians are somewhat beholden to the Americans still. A senior Ukrainian official says that Russia refused to discuss a pause on hitting civilian infrastructure. So we're going to do a little bit in this missile section, in the strike section, on kind of ceasefires, because we need to understand what's being aimed at, what's going on. Ihor Zhovka, deputy head of Zelensky's office, said that the Ukrainians did ask the Russians to stop hitting schools and hospitals, but the Russian team in Saudi Arabia said it did not have a mandate for that. So they've said, right, we're going to not hit energy infrastructure, but we're still going to blow up hospitals and schools. Well, yeah. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer said this. I'm going to play this to you.
And it's now, obviously, over 2 weeks since Ukraine agreed to an immediate 30-day ceasefire. That offer is still unanswered. It's over a week since Putin agreed to an energy and infrastructure ceasefire. But since then, Russia has hit energy infrastructure in cities across Ukraine. They've increased their bombardment, firing over 1,000 long-range drones at the country, hitting Ukrainian homes, schools and hospitals, with widespread civilian casualties.
So this is the British Prime Minister saying that the Russians have broken the ceasefire agreement on energy infrastructure. And we've got Zelensky saying the US believes that the ceasefire in the sea and energy infrastructure is working. Here's what I think. 2 days ago, there was a night when there were no strikes on energy infrastructure. Today, it was damaged in Kherson by Russian artillery. So that's interesting. And we're going to be speaking to Zarina Zabriskie later. But, you know, it might be that, yeah, we're not hitting energy infrastructure with drones, but we are hitting it with artillery. Well, is that covered by the ceasefire? Surely it should be. I mean, it's a ceasefire, right? That's how it works, he says. So there should be a reaction of the United States in actions. So Zelensky is calling for some kind of ramification for the Russians breaking the ceasefire, at least in terms of striking energy infrastructure in Kherson. Now, interestingly, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesman for the Ukrainians has said a future maritime ceasefire deal does not apply to Russian warships. So this Black Sea ceasefire deal doesn't apply to Russian warships. It covers civilian ships and ports, but not Russian military vessels, he emphasized. In other words, they're still going to try and blow up Russian military vessels, which actually sounds quite good for the Ukrainians if it doesn't indeed include that. Now, in terms of what the Ukrainians struck last night, there's some claims that Engels was targeted. Something blew up there. Some were claiming that these were Ukrainian drones, going towards the oil refinery. And of course, that would be breaking the ceasefire. But a claim here is that the Russian Scientific Research Institute of Chemical Current Sources in Saratov has been struck by Ukrainian drones. The facility develops batteries and fuel cells for the Russian military. So that looks to be a military industrial target. We do have claims this morning from the Russians that the Sudzha gas metering plant that previously was on fire and looking rather like this has been struck again. So I don't know if they're just regurgitating old footage. And also, when that was hit the other day and burned for a while, there was an argument as to who struck it the other day. So the Russians are claiming the Ukrainians did that. And the Ukrainians who had been in Sudzha, controlling Sudzha, not blown it up then, are saying, well, no, this was a false flag. You guys struck this. And that's what they're claiming again. So as expected, Russia's MOD claims that Ukraine attacked its energy infrastructure. So Russia's so clever at these false flag operations and breaking rules and breaking ceasefires and treaties, but blaming it on the other side. They've got massive form for this. Was it Michael Clark on Sky News was saying they've broken 190 agreements, the Russians, in the last however many years. This is just form for them. So it seems actually very plausible that the Russians would have done something like this in order to blame the Ukrainians for breaking the ceasefire, to say, right, well, then we're just going to carry on in it. And do you know what? It's the Ukrainians' fault, right? So anyway, but it could have also been the Ukrainians, right? So as expected, the Russian MOD has claimed that Ukraine attacked its energy infrastructure despite an alleged ceasefire, typical Kremlin narrative to shift blame. Moscow reports HIMARS strikes on a Sudzha gas station and drone attacks on a Saratov oil refinery. Now, I'll tell you this. if the Ukrainians attacked Sudzha, this would be a Ukrainian reconnaissance drone. Why is there a Russian reconnaissance drone? They could have put this up to look at the fire afterwards, but it seems rather fortuitous that there's a reconnaissance drone looking at a Ukrainian strike. You would only have a reconnaissance drone for a Russian strike, So anyway, Moscow reports HIMARS strikes on the Sudzha gas station and drone attacks on the Saratov oil refinery. But again, it's looking like it's somewhere else in Saratov. But anyway, I guess we'll see, along with power outages in Belgorod. So the Russians going heavy on Ukraine breaking the ceasefire agreement there. And then we have, Russian claims to that effect. I guess we'll have to wait and see. Now, as I reported yesterday in one of my videos, Ukrainian strikes on the Russian energy sector have caused huge damage in the last 6 months. Claims here 658 million, but then there's another claim that one place has 863 million. So I don't know, the numbers are a bit funky in this. But anyway, in the last 6 months, according to a joint investigation by Radio Liberty and Front Intelligence Insight, Ukrainian drones have struck oil and gas production facilities and natural resource storage sites at least 25 times in the last 6 months. In addition, dozens of Russian military facilities were damaged or completely destroyed during the same period, and the largest strike on an oil storage facility in terms of total damage occurred in October 2024. In the temporarily occupied Feodosia, where 11 tanks with a total volume of 69,000 cubic meters were destroyed. According to estimates, the maximum monetary damage could exceed 37.5 million rubles there. It's also noted that, and this is what I don't understand, if the Astrakhan gas processing plant is in a complete shutdown state for 6 months, the time to repair gas condensate processing unit destroyed by the Ukrainian strike, then the total damage would amount. Right, so, okay, I get it now. I misinterpreted this yesterday. So if Astrakhan is shut down for a further 6 months, which is thought it will be, then actually the cost will be 863 million. In other words, the way I now interpret that is that an extra $200 million of damage will be, or of opportunity costs will be incurred by that Astrakhan being out for 6 months. Interesting. Yeah, actually, the only thing I could find is that Russian forces have attacked Naftogaz, which is a national gas provider in Ukraine. Naftogaz Group infrastructure again, marking the 18th attack since the full-scale invasion began, and the 8th this year. The company warns that these strikes are not just attacks on infrastructure, but efforts to undermine energy stability. So both sides very clearly claiming the other side has attacked their energy infrastructure. And somebody's probably lying somewhere. Right, let's move on to other bits and pieces. We're going to start with, unsurprising, that pro-Kremlin blogger Patrick Lancaster was eager to film a story about Ukrainian atrocities in Sudzha, where we've just been talking about in the Kursk region. However, locals told him that Ukrainian military did not treat them badly, did not hurt them, but on the contrary, always greeted them and brought them bread and water. Who knew? Yeah. Okay, Russia is preparing an offensive on Zaporizhia, as we heard, potentially trying to get this corridor, to Transnistria. That's never going to happen, let's face it. But they are intensifying attacks in Zaporizhia, is the claim that I think probably has some justification. We've seen activity around Mali Shabaki. The Kremlin has created pipe hysteria across Russia. This is one of these weird stories. With Russians lining up to crawl through the replica of the gas pipeline in which 800 Russian soldiers were sent to their deaths in last month's failed military operation in Sudzha. We've got this signed pipeline that they appear to be lining up by a church to go through to get blessings. Just incredible. I mean, what there. Anywho, onto reality-based things. 69% of Ukrainians have trust in President Zelensky, a poll finds. The survey found that only 28% of respondents do not trust Zelensky, resulting in a trust-distrust balance of plus 41. Now, you find me another leader in a democratic world that has anything similar to that. I mean, that's pretty good figures, I have to say, which is in stark contrast to what was claimed by Donald Trump a number of times. And of course, what Donald Trump claims seems to be rather similar to what the propagandists in Ukraine are pumping out. So, yeah, there is that. According to the Center for Economic Strategy, so another survey here, and only, or some more stats, only 43% of the refugees worldwide plan on returning versus 74% 2 years earlier. This is completely to be expected, but it would be a worry for the Ukrainian government because those people that are abroad, people that could be contributing to the tax, to the treasury, unfortunately, the longer you are away from your home, the more roots you're going to put down, and the less likely it is that you're going to return. So 2 years ago, 74% of refugees said they were going to return. Now 43% plan on returning. That's a huge difference there. For many, what matters is not only when the war ends, but how. Many Ukrainians fear Russia would attack again soon. So yeah, here's the article title: Ukrainian refugees may be in Europe for good. Of course, for some nations, actually, that's kind of what they're like. With stagnating economies, you need to grow. Okay, so you need increased consumption. And with birth rates declining in modern Western democracies, the best way of getting that is through immigration. But the problem is immigration is really controversial, but actually it's economically rather useful. So refugees from somewhere like Ukraine that won't have the kind of social cohesion issues that maybe some other nations, you can imagine this influx of brown-skinned people and with different religion and vastly different languages, that might cause a strain on social cohesion. There might be this natural barrier that people put up, whereas Ukrainian refugees coming from a war from the country next door type thing might be a case of refugees that are easier to assimilate, not because they objectively are like in and of themselves, but because of the perception of people who are in the receiving countries. And actually, it may be so in Poland and Hungary and these places, Ukrainian refugees might actually be quite welcome for the economies there, as far as those European countries are concerned, in a economic climate that needs as much boosting as it can get. So yeah, you're going to have all sorts of dynamics at play. Anyway, going to the US, we heard that the Doge cuts, Elon Musk and his lackeys cutting USAID funding and whatnot has also resulted in Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty having its licenses or its grants removed. Now we're hearing that a federal judge has temporarily blocked the Trump administration's efforts to cut off all federal funds to Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty. President's senior advisor at the agency that oversees the broadcaster withdrew the cancellation of the network's grants. That's really good news, but it's weird because, of course, Europe said, yeah, we're going to take over, or we're going to... It was a bit vague, but Ursula von der Leyen was talking about supporting Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty based in Czechia, as the headquarters are. Well, now there's a temporary reprieve, it seems. A rare but temporary U-turn from Trump this evening. Washington Post says that White House... Oh, no, that's another reprieve. So it's going to be interesting to see how Radio Free Europe is used by the Americans. I wonder if they'll say, okay, so the judge has made it so we have to continue these grants. Let's turn this into a kind of MAGA amplification setup. So it could be that it, a bit like Voice of America, which is another very closely connected organization, appears to be going down the kind of real over flag waving, kind of almost jingoistic type narrative amplification, and I wonder whether the same might happen here. Now, there's been another U-turn, so a rare but temporary U-turn with Trump last night. Apparently, The White House, under pressure from its own base, has reversed its decision to shut down the war crimes investigation. So this is the Yale University funded investigation into the children basically extracted from Ukraine and filtered through Russia to be often given, adopted out, whatever, all sorts of different ways of like stealing children from Ukraine. And that was being investigated by this project in the US that was being funded, obviously, by the Americans here, that had its funding cut. And this caused a controversy because you're talking about war crimes and stealing children. So if anything's going to rile people, if anything's going to get some support for Ukraine, it's going to be a decision like this. Now, that has been reversed, but it will only be funded for 6 more weeks, which is enough time to allow the documentation to be sent to the EU, because there was a worry that they were destroying all the documentation. That was one of the rumours that initially came out. This is good news. So Washington Post reports Trump reverses termination of program tracking mass child abductions in Ukraine. So it gets a 6-week reprieve. That's the Yale University's Humanitarian Research Lab, which was one of the many projects terminated by sort of Doge and the US administration. But there's been quite a lot of pressure. And I think, was there a letter sent? Yes. So there's been a bipartisan letter sent in demanding that something be done about this. So I think there was not only kind of a bit of protest from people on the ground, if you like, but actually from lawmakers themselves on both sides of the aisle. Good news that that's been reversed. Now, Russian economy is in free fall, says this article. I don't know I wish they would post who it's from. But anyway, the Russian economy is in free fall as mortgage costs triple. We've seen this over the course of the war. I've reported many times on sort of commercial property and private property mortgage costs going through the roof, or they've tripled, and there are mass layoffs crippling major firms. So the construction industry at the moment is in all sorts of issue. I think Jonathan Fink last night was talking about one construction firm, one of the biggest ones, because you've got Gazprom in the energy sector being in all sorts of trouble. Well, the biggest construction firm, I think it is, as well, as are many others. Indication of crisis in Russia, asked Tim White, in what is maybe the biggest oligarch fallout since the jailing of Khodorkovsky. Billionaire Vadim Moshkovich has been arrested. The fraud accusation, possibly a 10-year sentence, is ridiculous, as they're all corrupt. We need to know why now. This is exactly what has happened with the military purges that we've seen. They're all corrupt, and they get done on corruption, but it's like, well, they're all corrupt. So what you're doing is you're just waiting for the right time to get rid of these people. So that's the question, why now? So with those military personnel, like, was it Ivanov, what's his name? Anyway, the deputy to Shoigu, who has had this sports facility supposedly built on an island near Vladivostok, and it turns out it's a luxury chalet. That was the latest, but he's already done for all sorts of other things. The fact is, they're all doing stuff like this. So the FSB know that, and they just pick the right time to use that against them. It's not like they made up the corruption charges often. It's just that, well, we knew you were doing it anyway. We're just waiting until we needed to use that. Now, just a little bit on the peace deal. As I said yesterday, and we talked about at length last night, Jonathan Fink and myself, the minerals deal. I'll tell you what, this morning there's even more people going off on the minerals deal. It is absolutely terrible. It is mass extortion. It is a horrific deal that would even require repayment with a 4%. It's like the loans of, not the loans, the gifts of military aid. It's just ridiculous. It's like I've said before, me giving you Christmas presents and then coming back to you 2 months later and saying, I demand the value of that Christmas present, but actually more than the Christmas present will cost me, but I want that money back plus 4% every month. That's what the US is doing. They're screwing in not only that, but it's just the worst deal ever. The minerals deal is horrific. Christopher Miller from the Financial Times says, we obtained the US proposal. The Trump administration is pushing to gain sweeping control over all of Ukraine's major minerals and energy assets while offering Kyiv no security guarantees in an aggressive expansion of previous demands. And the previous demands were terrible. It is awful. The new US-Ukraine minerals deal could trap Ukraine in a $120 billion debt, analysts warn. Under the deal, Ukraine must repay the US aid, military, budgetary and humanitarian, since 2022, with the sum growing 4% annually, extorting mafiosi. It is horrific. And as we said last night, there are two options. Either they know it's horrific and they made it horrific so that Ukraine reject it, and then they punish Ukraine for rejecting it and create this scenario where they can blame Ukraine and then either pull out of the war completely or just go onto Russia's side blaming Ukraine. Or they have so much over Ukraine that Ukraine are forced to do this, and it is just pure extortion. Either way, it's terrible. So Bill Browder says there's no chance Ukraine will sign this insane and offensive minerals deal. This is just a way of Trump to blame the breakdown in negotiations on Zelensky instead of Putin and walk away from Ukraine. So that's one of the options there. And Anders Aslan said the US proposal on mineral and energy agreement with Ukraine appears sheer extortion. 1, no security support. 2, US claims $100 billion in prior contribution through its grants to Ukraine. 3, US majority on board equals a colonial agreement. Ukraine must say no, and there's more to it than that, obviously. Now, then there was a coalition of the willing with European leaders and delegates meeting with Zelensky, run by Emmanuel Macron and pretty much Keir Starmer as well. Shashank Joshi from The Economist says, European messaging today in Paris was exemplary. Strong message that Europe won't prematurely lift sanctions for the sake of a terrible Black Sea deal. Efforts to goad Trump into seeing he's being played. Signals that Europe won't accept caps on Ukraine's military, and pressing on with coalition planning. So that is really good news. You know, strength coming out of the European chats there. Then, and this is a bit to add to all of that, then Putin had a speech last night, and that was fascinating. He said there is no reason to believe that the Russian armed forces will finish off the Ukrainian troops. Oh, sorry, there is reason to believe that they will finish off the Ukrainian troops, so they're going to wipe out the Ukrainians. Russia is ready to cooperate with Europe on the settlement of the Ukraine conflict, but they are trying to deceive us. He then also talks about BRICS helping us to solve this and blah, 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 blah. Trump sincerely seeks to end the Ukrainian conflict. The Kremlin supports a peaceful solution, but only by eliminating the root causes. So we're back to denazification, demilitarization, blah, blah, blah. Russia wants to guarantee its security for many years to come. Putin named the BRICS countries and North Korea among the partners with whom Russia is ready to cooperate on the settlement in Ukraine. And the other hugely important thing he said is that the Nazis are still in control of Russia and they in Ukraine, and that they have demanded a temporary UN-led government be put in place in Ukraine. Now, thankfully, the White House has dismissed Putin's proposal for a temporary government in Ukraine. Putin suggested a transitional administration overseen by the UN and several countries could be formed in Ukraine to organize elections. Everything that that Putin said last night, it appears to be pretty much going back to the maximalist objectives and back to square one. So after all of these negotiations, Putin then comes out and essentially says, you know, we want everything that we wanted previously. Now, if the US even remotely agree to any of that, then the US need to be rejected completely from these negotiations because they are just operating on behalf of Russia. But I think it should be plainly obvious that we just need to stay strong in supporting Ukraine and force Russia to submit to a Ukraine that's in a stronger position. And submit to negotiations that are just, right? What we want is a just and lasting peace. And I think just by appeasing Russia, you're clearly not going to get that. And that, sadly, is kind of where the United States is. Anyway, that's enough from me. You guys take care, and I'll speak to you soon.